For the folks at home, it's this book right here. I don't know if you can. The reflection is probably. I hope
Yeah, a little bit. It's called Not Just Another Scenario.
Yeah.
Okay. By Rabbi Winston, right?
Pinhas Winston, right there.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're going straight to the end, where this is how Pinhas Winston sees or a possible way that the verses, the prophecies play out.
Yeah.
So physically, there was no way for a human eye to see it.
Yeah.
But the Redeemer knew exactly where to look. More importantly, he knew exactly what to do. Looking up into the sky from the edge of the Sinai desert, he raised the ancient staff entrusted to him in the direction of the Iranian missile that was just re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, which had already been launched, right? In this book.
Yeah.
Then he said the 42-letter name of God, right? The one that Moshe Rabbeinu himself had used to kill the Egyptian over 3,200 years ago. Actually, at this point, it's 3,336 years ago. Actually, no, it was more than that. Okay. It was part of a secret tradition known only to a few Kabbalists and prophets throughout the ages. He paused for a moment and then continued his journey, the Mashiach. Back at launch controls in Tehran, however, there was complete silence. All the launch technicians could do was stare with blank faces at their computer terminals. Some checked and rechecked the incoming data, but still no missile. No missile, no explanation what was going on. Then it said early warning center, Golan Heights. This is already a different location. Somebody said, "That's right, General. It disappeared." The commander-in-chief of the center said again, quote, "It was there one moment, and just as it entered the atmosphere, poof, it disappeared." The general said nothing. This was the second such incident in 2 days, and he did not know how to tell the prime minister about this one. He would certainly lose his credibility in the eyes of his superiors. If he wanted a future in the government, that was the last thing he could afford to lose. And somebody says, "You are sure you checked the instruments, Commander?" the general asked. "Yes, sir, several times already. My men are starting to get spooked." "Spooked, Commander? What's that supposed to mean?" Now it was the commander's turn to worry about his own credibility. So he said, somewhat cautiously, "Sir, there's something going on here. Of course there is. And it's called a war, a big war." "I don't mean that, sir. We're all well aware of the fact over here." "Then what do you mean, man?" We don't have time for tea and cookies, the general snapped. Okay. So he continues, "I mean, missiles disappearing, planes getting shot at and coming back safely. I mean, something big is happening." The commander expected to lose his position at that point and leave the army in disgrace, but to his utter shock, the general changed his angry tone and simply remarked, "I think I know what you mean, Commander, but try to maintain yourselves as much as possible and do a good job. The country is depending on you." "Yes, sir," the commander answered with relief as the general hung up the phone. He had no idea what had softened the general's tone all of a sudden. He was a man known for his fierce atheistic views in a country that shunned God and religion. Let's talk about Israel. However, the commander would have been even more surprised to see the general take the crumpled piece of round material hidden in his right hand and place it on his head for the first time in God only knows how long. Probably a kippah, right? It was not an easy decision to make. It represented a major shift in his belief system, one that the general had never even considered before. You okay? You okay? What he didn't know, though, was that it was happening in so many places, all over the country. For like the commander had said, something big was happening, and it was getting to the point that only a fool could overlook what was becoming obvious. The general wasn't sure at this point if the state of Israel was about to meet its end after only a half century in existence. But he thought to himself, if God is involved, then maybe heaven has had enough of the secular state once and for all. The thought made his hair stand on end. Okay. Now we go to America. Mr. President, the undersecretary called over the army line. Says the Americans have sent 3 cruise missiles into Arab territory. The president of Russia thought for a moment. Oh, sorry, I thought this was in America. This is Russia. We're in Moscow now. Okay. The president of Russia thought for a moment and then said, "We can't just sit back and let the Americans tip the scales in the war against our friends, the Arabs, can we? What shall we do, Mr. President?" "The only thing we can do," said the president, trying to contain his inner glee. The Americans had taken the precise path that he had laid for them. Order a counterstrike against positions inside Israel. Then, reclining back in his leather chair, he added, "But Undersecretary Bavolich," Bavolich. He said, "Sir?"
Swolage. Yeah.
Swolage, right. Be sure that only places distant from Arab areas are targeted. We don't need any more mistakes." "Yes, Mr. President, I'll take care of it immediately." So the president leaned all the way back in his chair, folded his hands behind his head, and stared straight up at the high, ornate ceiling. It was time to plan his next move in a war that was sure to leave Russia as the only true superpower. Just then, another phone rang. Caught off guard, the president jerked his head to the left, slightly hurting his neck. Before picking up the receiver, he already knew who was at the other end because it was the special phone that linked the Kremlin to the White House. The Russian president let it ring a few times, then picking it up said, "Mr. President." He goes, "Leonid," President James, the American president said,
Yeah.
"It is not worth it." And then said, "What is not worth it, Mr. President?" The Russian president played. "You know what I mean, getting any more involved in this war than you already are." But you can, the president snapped. He had wanted to remain cool to give the impression of quiet control, but he was a hot-headed man, and his temper flared at the American president's interference with Russian policy. "Leonid, Israel is a tiny country with a couple of million people. The Arab states are massive. They have oil. Israel can't defend herself on her own. We're just trying to balance out the sides. I'm sorry, Mr. President, but I have obligations to my allies, just as you have to yours. But if you get involved," the American president said, "but if you get involved, the war will escalate and become nuclear," the president said in desperation. "The Israelis will not go down without taking everyone else around them as well." And this is exactly what the Russian president wanted. "It is too late, Mr. President." "What do you mean, man, that it's too late?" the president asked. "It's too late, Mr. President, because as we speak, there are Russian smart missiles on their way to Israeli positions, 3 to be exact." There was silence on the line. It was clear to President James that he was not going to make any headway with his Russian counterpart and that he was wasting his breath. It was also clear that the world was sliding faster towards oblivion. "So be it," he said, and hung up. For a moment, the Russian president doubted his plan as he hung up the special phone to the White House, but only for a moment, after which time he became filled with an arrogance of biblical proportions. He's like Pharaoh, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Back to Israel. The fighting was fierce even in Jerusalem. Every time Eli, who's the main protagonist in this book, every time Eli and his family heard a building get hit, they felt the ground shake. They were only able to just sit and look at each other. Tom Gerlitz and his wife had become somewhat despondent, even dreaming that they would end their lives this way. That's Eli's parents, his secular Jewish parents. Eli himself tried to remain positive and to instill the group with confidence. However, the sound of the war coming closer made it hard to convince even himself of a happy ending. For a moment, he doubted the wisdom of having told his parents and family to join him in Israel. "Look," he said to everyone, "you have to believe that God will save us. I don't believe that he will abandon us, especially those who have done mitzvot and have been self-sacrificing to live in his palace. He can't." There was no reaction from anyone. It merely sounded like a desperate man's rhetoric. And then he says, I know it looks really bad, but it was that way too in Egypt, just before Moshe Rabbeinu came and destroyed Egypt and freed the Jewish people. The Torah says that when Moshe came back the second time, the people were kotzer ruach. They had shortness of breath from the hopelessness of the situation. It was so bad that they couldn't even listen to Moshe speak to them. He says, I once heard a rabbi speak and say that in the final redemption, it will be the same as well. He said that the situation will also look hopeless. It actually looks more hopeless now than the description in this book.
Yeah.
Because in this book, he's describing an Israeli government that's actually trying to save their people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the situation is beginning to look hopeless, Defense Minister Shlomo Yehuda Benir told Prime Minister Dagan in the specially fortified bunker. We are losing crucial ground on almost all fronts. Casualties are high, and we have lost many planes. Now, what are you suggesting, Shlomo? The Prime Minister asked. That we surrender. We all know that the Arabs are not interested in POWs. Are you suggesting that we sneak out the back door and let our land fall into the hands of for good? No, Shmuel. You know I would never suggest any of that, but we have only one last option that we never used before, and maybe it's time to do so. You've already signed the necessary documents. All you need to do is give the green light. The Prime Minister eyed his defense minister and close confidant. Even though he knew that he was right and that the existence of his country was about to come to an end, it was nevertheless hard to order a nuclear attack.
Mm-hmm.
Very hard. Now it's going to go to the Mashiach. The Redeemer had reached the border that divided Israel from Jordan. You hearing this, bro?
Yeah. Yeah.
The Redeemer had reached the border that divided Israel from Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
He looked up to his right. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of gunfire and mortar shelling. But what concerned him at the moment were the fast-approaching Russian smart missiles that were headed for 3 key Israeli cities.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The Redeemer paused and remained seated on his donkey. Then, at the correct moment, he raised his staff again and repeated the same procedure as before. At the precise moment, 3 Russian missiles changed course and no longer posed a threat to Jewish lives. At launch control back in Moscow, however, it was a different story. Quote, what do you mean they just changed course? General Kamishikov yelled at the launch commander. Folks, we're laughing because I don't know if these are real Russian names.
These names are like ridiculous.
Right.
Thank you, Rabbi Pinhas Winston, for the
close enough.
comic relief. Yeah.
Close enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, he goes, we are tracking them, the terrified commander explained, knowing that he would be blamed even though it was not his fault. And then all of a sudden they changed course. Well, just send a new signal and put them back on course, the general barked, hiding his own fear of his having to speak to his superior, President Kuchevskov. Kuchevskov, okay? General, that was the first thing we tried to do, but they are not responding. The general thought for a moment and then became worried about errant missiles hitting the wrong target, which would certainly cost him his job, if not his life. Destroy them immediately, the general said. He goes, we can't do that, General, the commander deadpanned. They are no longer accepting our signals. What? Then the general asked the most frightening question of all. Where are they headed for now, Commander? There was a pause over the phone. Commander, where are those missiles headed? General, according to the present flight path, within minutes they will hit the Jerusalem mosques. Are you telling me that Russian missiles are going to blow up Arab mosques? The general cried, feeling terrified, angry, and helpless all at the same time. He had to think quick because in moments an international crisis was about to occur. For the folks at home, the thing that I disagree with here with this narrative is that nobody would give a damn if they actually hit the mosques.
Yeah, exactly.
They just blame the Jews.
Yeah, pretty much. pretty much.
It's really easy. They don't care about
Yeah.
killing people, and they'll just blame the Jews for anything anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, all of a sudden, back to the story. All of a sudden, the computer screen that tracked the missiles beeped incessantly and showed the missiles having hit their targets. The first missile slammed right into the Dome of the Rock, blowing it up into a million pieces, along with all the unwitting worshippers inside.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, the second smart missile hit the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the other side of the mount, and it too disintegrated. The explosions were deafening and left gaping holes in the Temple Mount. Very little of the mosques remained, and the entire area was filled with carnage. Black smoke billowed high above and could be seen from miles away. The third Russian missile smashed into the side of the Mount of Olives, right along the road that divided the upper part from the lower part. It was the road that the Arabs had built right through the famous Har Hazetim cemetery. They did that to disgrace it. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Word of what happened spread like wildfire. People who witnessed it with their own eyes were stunned. They raced through the streets in whatever means of transportation they could find, telling as many people as they could about the phenomenal miracle. All of a sudden, talk about the imminent revelation of Mashiach filled the people with hope. Even the hardcore atheists were awestruck. Many came to religious communities begging for help to do tshuva. Some made makeshift yarmulkes and tzitzit, anything they could do to show God they sincerely wanted to repent. It was in the air. Tragically, some, unable to face the change of reality and believing they had sinned more than God would forgive, took their own lives. A few even died from the shock of the war itself, believing the end of the state was at hand. In the battlefield, hope was all but lost. Corporal Levy knew only one thing, that he was in great pain and probably bleeding to death. When he twisted his head to his left, he saw with his blurred vision what looked like his best friend lying in his own blood, obviously dead. In the distance, he could see enemy tanks advancing. He couldn't believe that after so many decades of repelling Arab attacks, that finally the Arabs were successful at destroying the Jewish state. Distraught and in pain, he began to whimper like a child and considered taking what was left of his own life. After a few moments, the corporal looked up. He squinted his eyes as he tried to restore his vision. Then he saw something that made him wonder if he had already died. But the fact that the war raged all around him quickly made him realize that he was still very much a part of this world. What the corporal saw was an old man sitting on a white donkey in the middle of the battlefield. And he was thinking to himself, was that man crazy? Had he lost his mind? Then all of a sudden, the corporal realized that the man was not getting killed. Though he was in the line of gunfire and tank fire, the man was not getting killed. The corporal could not understand what he was watching, and he assumed that he was hallucinating. He watched with a curiosity that was enough to temporarily distract him from his own suffering, as the man dismounted his donkey and then turned to face the oncoming tank brigade as if to challenge them. He watched as the old man took a long pole in his right hand and stood his ground. The tanks stopped in their tracks. The head tank commander had seen the figure through his binoculars and ordered the tank column to cease advancement, and within minutes they all came to a grinding halt. At first he had thought it was some weird Bedouin standing in the middle of a no man's land, but upon opening the hatch and peering from the top of the tank, he realized that it was an old Jewish man. There was something about the man and his donkey that made him uncomfortable. And he said, what was all the commander could say was, in Arabic, right? As he adjusted his binoculars to a clearer focus. The commander of the tank brigade was a giant of a man and a Palestinian. And seeing the old Jew out in the field like that sparked something inside of him. In fact, he found himself becoming consumed with anger. Even he was surprised at his instantaneous and seemingly primordial feelings of hatred for this old Jew. Next, we're about to go somewhere else. Okay, I think this is America now. The music came to a quick stop as the camera zoomed in on the anchorman, Tom Brooks, who was doing his best to look gravely serious. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Brooks with WBC 6 o'clock Evening News. Behind the newscaster's head, images of the raging Middle East war began to play. Our top story tonight is the devastating battle taking place in the Middle East. According to our man in the field, Jerry Hoffman, it does not look very good for the Israelis, does it, Jerry? That's right, Tom. I'm sure you can hear the gunshots and artillery fire in the background. In fact, we're going to have to ask you to speak up a bit. It's hard to hear you. As of 3 o'clock Israeli time, there was confirmation that the Syrians, after a vicious battle, retook the coveted and strategic Golan Heights, putting the Israelis at an extreme disadvantage. The country that controls those mountains has perfect aim at the enemy below. Jerry, what about the West Bank? In the West Bank, the Israelis have made some ground, but at a tremendous cost. And they haven't fared much better in the air as well. The famous IAF can only fight so many planes at one time, and they seem to just keep coming from the Arab side. Any more word on the Temple Mount and those errant Russian missiles that destroyed the mosques and churches? The entire Arab world is up in arms, and many are calling for a jihad against the Russians. But the Jews are calling it a miracle in advance of their Messiah's arrival. Sir, are you are you responding to your good friends and trolls and stuff like that?
No. I'm not responding to anything. I respond to nothing.
Okay.
I listen.
Okay. Well, I sure hope they're right, Tom Brooks said, because the clock is running out for the tiny Jewish state. Thanks for the report, Jerry. How much longer are reporters staying close to the action? That's the big question in the reporter pool, especially since the specter of nuclear war hangs over all of our heads. Everyone has known for some time that the Israelis have a well-equipped nuclear arsenal. The only question is, what will it take to make them use it, and where? And if that happens, Tom Brooks added, then it might just be the beginning of another world war. It's a terrifying thought, Tom. The picture of Jerry Hoffman froze on the screen behind Tom Brooks, signaling the end of that segment of the news. That was Jerry Hoffman from outside of Jerusalem, Israel. He will have more news for us again in a little later. Okay. Now we're going to another scene somewhere else. Rabbi Rubin, like many other rabbis around the world, looked out at the sea of faces that packed the synagogue, even on Yom Kippur. The attendance was not that good, and it made him very sad to think it took a threat to the existence of the Jewish people to bring them out. He stepped up to the lectern and spoke. He said, I will make this brief. He paused to make sure that everyone was quiet and listening. I don't think there's anyone here today who is unaware of how serious the situation is for our people in Eretz Yisrael. The rabbi had thought about all kinds of approaches to stir his congregants to teshuvah and had rejected them all. This was not like preparing a Shabbat drasha for which he had become well known. The last time the situation had been so serious was in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, when he had only been a young boy. That war only turned around because of a big miracle. Would they be so fortunate this time? He wondered. Jews had been scared then, very scared. But when the war did end, people went right back to normal again, and normal, right? And the Arab situation only continued to get worse for Israel. And in America, assimilation and intermarriage continued to increase. Somehow the rabbi felt that this time God was looking for change, serious change. In the end, he decided that he would take no approach and just say whatever came to his heart once he stood before everyone. And that's what he did. So this is him speaking now. What if this is the last war? The rabbi began. I don't mean for Israel alone. I meant for the whole world. People started looking at each other, wondering what the rabbi was getting at. He says, we as Orthodox Jews believe in the coming of the Mashiach. It's one of the 13 principles of faith mentioned by the Rambam or Maimonides to believe that Mashiach could come any day. To not believe this, says the Rambam, is to deny the Torah. Okay. But, the rabbi said, now absorbed by the seriousness of the moment, if Mashiach were to come today or tomorrow, would we be ready for him? Would we welcome him with open arms and joyously travel to Eretz Yisrael and leave our life in America behind with no regrets? The rabbi gave everyone a few seconds to contemplate their answer. Where are our hearts today? To whom do we give our loyalty? You say to God? You say to Torah? But is that the real honest truth? Because you could fool me, and you could fool your wife and your friends, but you can't fool him. On Yom Kippur, we talk about how God is Bochen Lev Adam. He examines the hearts of man to know our innermost thoughts that we ourselves might not even be aware of. The rabbi paused to collect his thoughts. The people waited for him. Since I took this job some 25 years ago, I've stressed the importance of longing for redemption and life in Eretz Yisrael. I told you that even if you can't make it there, even if you can't make Aliyah and live in the king's palace close to the wall over which our sages teach, the blessing for the whole world flows. At the very least, you must yearn to be there. And I warned you, and you've often criticized me for doing so, that if we don't show our appreciation for the gift of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, right, then one day we would lose her, God forbid. Well, my friends, all of a sudden and completely unplanned, the rabbi burst out into sobs. Through his crying, he said, my friends, we are losing her. As I speak to you right now, we are losing her. And with her, the lives of so many of our upright and self-sacrificing brothers. And do you think it's a test for the people of Eretz Yisrael? The rabbi said, scanning the entire crowd as if to make eye contact with all there. No. If they die, they will die kadoshim, as holy people, and they will go right to the world to come. They will die as Jews for the sake of our Jewish homeland and Torah values. Even the secular Jew will have died defending the Jewish homeland. The rabbi paused to regain his composure. Not one person took their eye from the rabbi. No, my fellow Jews, this is a test for sure, but for us. For all of us Jews living outside of Eretz Yisrael, in what we believe to be relative safety. It is a test of our faith to see how devoted we are to the idea of redemption, which might be moments away, for all we know. It is to see how much we long to live as a unified people on the holy soil of the land of our forefathers, under the banner of Torah. Rabbi paused again and then closed by saying, and we had better decide soon, because there will be no second chances. You can be sure of that. It is time to wake up from this dream called exile and come to terms with our history, with our destiny. The rabbi looked at the entire mass of people before him. He could hear quiet sobbing from the women's section, and he could see some people wiping tears from their faces. He knew that many of his congregants had family and close friends living in Israel and were obviously worried about their well-being. So he said, you were handed sheets when you first walked in, Rabbi Rubin said in a sobbing tone. We will recite them together, probably to Hillel. Okay, and here's the final chapter, the battle. Okay, so last time we saw Mashiach, he was facing down the tank, the entire army of tanks from Jordan, right? Kind of interesting is what you just told me about people, crazy Iraqis coming.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so here we go. And I might repeat some of the stuff that I said before. But anyway, even though they were quite far away from each other, the Redeemer and the tank commander seemed to lock eyes from the distance. The soldier was uncomfortable. He felt as if the old Jew was looking right into his very being, though he knew that was impossible. Or so he thought. Instinctively, the commander spit into the sand for all to see, to reveal his disgust for the old man, but the old man remained unfazed and just held his ground. The other soldiers in the tank brigade looked at each of them and wondered why their commander was making such a big deal about an old Jew. They wondered why the commander didn't just give the order to run him over, as they were planning to do the rest of the Zionist state. An event that they were confident would happen any day now. One of the Arabs, upon seeing the old man and the donkey, came out of his tank. He scrutinized the strange image before him and recalled the tradition that he had once learned from a Jewish neighbor about a Messiah coming to redeem the Jewish people on a donkey. The Mashiach, he whispered to himself in Arabic. Well, I guess, I should have whispered, Mashiach. He whispered to himself in Arabic. The Mashiach, he said again a little louder, as blood began to run through his veins at an increasingly fast pace. Then, all of a sudden, he turned and began to run away in the opposite direction, like a man who had just seen a ghost. He had not been more than 50 feet away when a fellow soldier raised his gun and shot the man down in his tracks. He fell to the ground with an audible thud. As a result, some of the other soldiers began to get nervous, though they weren't sure why. The tank commander picked up on this and ordered all the soldiers back into their vehicles, as he himself began to climb into his own tank. But as he did, the Redeemer said in a loud voice in some ancient words, he said, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of God, Master of Legions, the God of the battalions of Israel, that you have ridiculed. On this day God will deliver you into my hand, and I shall smite you." The tank commander, who spoke perfect Hebrew, slowly turned his head back towards the old man. The words the Jew spoke seemed hauntingly familiar, though the Palestinian could not fathom why. He didn't know about reincarnation or sparks from the past, nor did he care. He was Colonel Abdul Igbar Jani, and that's all he knew for sure. As the last of the tank hatches closed, the colonel gave the command for the tank brigade to move forward. He knew he would personally enjoy the pleasure of running the old Jew over. His only regret was that because of the thick metal of his armored vehicle, he wouldn't be able to hear the meshing of the old Jew's bones as the tank ran over him. But the Redeemer still did not move. He barely even blinked. In the meantime, the Jewish corporal had managed somewhat to free his body. He watched with amazement as the scene unfolded before his somewhat blurry eyes. He did not understand any of what he was watching. When the tanks were within 10 feet of the Redeemer, the corporal saw him slowly lift his arms in the air and point the staff at the approaching mass of metal and warfare. To his utter astonishment, the entire brigade came to a complete and immediate stop. The corporal rubbed his eyes and swallowed hard. Can it be? He asked himself. What was he witnessing? Just as he was thinking the impossible to himself, the friend he had given up for dead put his hand on his shoulder and jumped a mile. He jumped a mile. He turned around wide-eyed and in shock, ready to kill or be killed. When he saw his weakened friend almost collapse, he quickly calmed down and went to assist him before he reached the ground. Then, holding his friend around his chest to support him, they both turned to watch the dreamlike drama unfolding before them. The Redeemer raised his hand and staff towards the sky. He pronounced a string of Hebrew words that they could not hear, nor would they have recognized the words, even if they could have heard them. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if by movie special effects, the sky above began to darken quickly. But it was not a movie. It was very real. The Air Force pilots, though involved as they were in dogfights, also noticed a strange, unpredicted change in the weather. They became concerned. Degel 4 to Degel 1, leader, do you copy? The young Israeli fighter pilot called out, while at the same time trying to avoid being shot down. There was a little static, and then, Degel 4, this is Degel 1, I copy you. Degel 1, leader, storm at East 32, big black clouds, advise. It was one thing to dodge bullets at lightning speed, but something else altogether to dodge lightning at lightning speed. Degel 4, no time to return to base. Situation bad on the ground. Orders are to keep fighting until... Degel 1, leader, do you copy? You were cut off. I repeat, you were cut off. Degel 1, leader knew he was cut off, for he had cut himself off. As he looked up, a terrifying sight made his heart skip a beat. A whole string of incoming enemy jets and bombers. Degel 1, leader, I repeat, do you copy? Degel 4, this is Degel 1. I have a squadron of fighters and bombers headed my way. Sector 4, request backup. Okay. Request, that was an understatement. But even as Lieutenant Corporal Danny Roth spoke, he knew it was an impossible situation. Nevertheless, Israeli pilots were trained not to think about failure and death, just to fight until the end. And besides, who said the situation was any better back on the ground? Copy, Degel 1, leader. On the way, the pilot of Degel 4 said as he peeled left to join his combat commander in what would probably be his last battle. And he was right about that, but not for reasons that he knew yet. Within just a matter of seconds, the incoming enemy planes were shooting at the few Israeli jets that had been circling as they fought valiantly. At those speeds, there was never any time to be afraid. But the big black billowing clouds moved in fast. Just as two Russian MiGs cut into, excuse me, it's kind of a choppy sentence, 1 second. 2 Russian MiGs cut in on the tail of Degel 1. The shooting began, and the pilot and co-pilot began to take evasive action. When all of a sudden, lightning bolted out of one of the clouds and struck the Russian jets. Both of them exploded immediately and dropped towards the ground. Degel 1, do you copy? The anxious fighter pilot yelled into his headset. He had seen the whole thing from his own plane. This is Degel 1, over. Man, the pilot said, breaking Air Force protocol. That was something else. What are you talking about, Degel 4? Over. Degel 1 leader, you were cooked. Degel 4, what happened to those fighters? They were hit by lightning, both of them. Planes went down faster than a big rock on a spring day. That's what you call one big miracle, Degel 1 leader. One big miracle. Degel 1 leader considered the fighter's word, and then, looking heavenward, he whispered, "Thank God." Maybe he'd see his wife and children again after all. Back on the ground, the storm seemed to grow in size and intensity. In fact, if one could have seen it from the distance, they would have seen that it was growing up, and it was growing up and down the Israeli border, the entire Israeli border. Lightning flew in all directions while rain fell in even the most arid places. The thunder was deafening and made one feel as if heaven was angry, very angry, and expressing it in a manner both loud and clear. Okay, now we're going to another scene. Bill and Judy Truman were watching television back in Memphis, Tennessee. They were just 2 of hundreds of millions of Americans who were watching the same channel. Then all of a sudden, their program was interrupted as they all received the same news. "This is a news bulletin," the voiceover said, as the screen showed anchorman Jesse Falk shuffling his notes at his desk at CMN. CM, not N, CMN.
Yeah.
On cue, he looked up at the camera. "The situation in the Middle East has taken a curious turn of events. For details, we take you live to Jerusalem and reporter Dick Chessman." Okay. "Good evening, Jesse. If it looks dark to you on the screen, it's not just because it's night here. Dawn in Jerusalem was just over 1 hour ago. The sun has yet to become visible. As we talk, there's an amazing storm raging all around me, which was evident as the wind blew the reporter's hair across his face. There was lightning and thunder in the background." Okay. So he continues, "Are storms characteristic of Israel at this time of year, Dick?" "Not usually, Jesse, but this storm is different. According to satellite photos, this storm exists only up and down the Israeli border. The severity of the storm is preventing Arab and Russian planes and tanks from entering Israel. In fact," yes, Dick, are you there? Dick? "I'm here. I was about to say that according to Arab and Russian broadcasts, many of their planes have, well, just disappeared when they flew anywhere near the storm." There was a long pause, a big no-no for network television. But even though Jesse Falk was an experienced anchorman with 22 years worth of airtime, he was still taken aback by this information. Incredulously, and asking more for himself than for the millions of people who were now sitting on the edge of their seats, he finally said, "Is any of this confirmed, Dick?" There was another pause. "Just about all of it, Jesse." "Does anyone know the cause of this peculiar storm?" Pause. "Jesse," the reporter began cautiously, "in all my years of reporting, I've never heard or seen anything like it. And if it weren't for the seriousness of the situation, I wouldn't put my reputation on the line and answer that question. Dick, what could be that dramatic? How about an indestructible old Jew sitting on a white donkey?" Yes, that was a dramatic answer. And we've lost Greg, folks. Once again, we've lost Greg.
Why? I'm listening. What are you talking about?
Unresponsive. Egon, we've lost Greg. Okay.
I'm listening completely.
All right. Jesse Falk couldn't help but give off a laugh for a moment an instinctual reaction to a joke until he realized that his man in the field was not making any jokes. He quickly regained his composure and asked, all of this is being caused by an old man on his donkey? That's what I said, an old Jewish man on a donkey carrying some kind of long pole. Those close to the action said that he just lifted the pole up in the air, said some kind of Hebrew phrase, and stopped the whole tank brigade dead in his track. Wow, was all the anchorman could say, as shivers went up and down his spine. One of the advantages of television and the modern media in general is that in seconds, the whole world can witness such a phenomenon. One of the disadvantages of television was that the anchorman, Jesse Falk, couldn't see the flood of tears welling up in the eyes of many of his viewers all around the American South, people who believed in the concept of the Messiah. Would they still feel the same way when they find out who's Messiah, right? In like capital letters, who's, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Even if Jesse Falk couldn't see the flood of tears, he could hear the flood of telephone calls pouring into his station. Watchers trying to confirm what their eyes had just seen and their ears had just heard. Okay. In Chicago, the entire Bevman family sat transfixed in front of their television set. They'd been living from news report to news report to learn of the situation in the Middle East. But Rabbi Bevman, a conservative rabbi for many years, though a staunch Zionist, did not believe in the traditional concept of Mashiach. He believed in a more sophisticated concept. It was more of a collective effort, if you will. It was
Yeah.
Okay. All of a sudden, he was being forced to realize that he might have been mistaken. And as he watched the revelation from his own home, many of his followers were also witnessing it in their homes. And it did not take long before the Bevman phone began to ring. It was to be the first of countless phone calls that day, mostly from panicking congregants of the Beth Shalom synagogue, of which he was the rabbi and communal leader, not to mention calls from just about every one of his associates, including the local priests who knew that he was a rabbi. Anyway, so one crying woman complained to him, "You told us that all that Messiah business was baloney, that the Orthodox just made it up and just to make us religious. Rabbi, I'm so scared. Is God going to be angry with my family?" It was a typical question that day being asked by many panicking Jews all around the world. For thousands of years, they and many of their ancestors had lived to escape the Torah and its traditions. Now, apparently, it was catching up with them. Jewish history and Jewish destiny were, after 3,300 years, meeting head on. Okay, we're almost at the end. One brave reporter and camera crew dared to move closer to the front. It was the show of the century, and Richard Burgess was bound to get an award for his heroic reporting. The need to get ahead in a very competitive world may have been driving him, but divine providence was running the show. As they got within camera range, their signal was sent to the van back in Jerusalem, which they relayed. They relayed it to New York via satellite. The connection was unusually clear. Back at the New York station, at that precise moment, the technician gave the signal that indicated the program was a go. All of a sudden, tens of millions of television screens showed the back of a smallish older man dressed in clothing that looked rather biblical in style. To his left was a white donkey. Word of the connection resulted in instantaneous satellite link-ups all around the world. Within moments, hundreds of millions of viewers were watching the single old man facing a massive tank brigade. I think I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. Greg.
Well, I'm hearing wood being chopped. Or some kind of a woodpecker.
That's a Jewish lady preparing the Shabbat.
Baruch Hashem.
Shabbat food. What?
Yes.
Listen, what you're doing is, it's kind of important too. It's fine.
It's way more important than what we're doing.
That's better. I knew you could talk quieter all these years. Yeah, chop slow. That's right. Are these mushrooms? Back to the story. Okay. I thought they were cookies. All right. All right, all of a sudden, tens of millions of television screens showed the back of a smallish older man dressed in clothing that looked rather biblical in style. To his left was a white donkey. Word of the connection resulted in instantaneous satellite link-ups all around the world. Within moments, hundreds of millions of viewers were watching the single old man facing a massive tank brigade. The internet was buzzing with the story and pictures. Then, as if to talk to the entire Jewish nation, the old man turned in the direction of the camera and spoke in Hebrew. Yet his words were understandable to all, no matter what language a person spoke. So he said, "Children of Israel, children of the one God, children of the God of Abraham, of Yitzhak, and of Yaakov. Over 3,300 years ago, your fathers stood at Mount Sinai and accepted upon themselves the Torah and the service of God." His penetrating eyes gave even distant listeners the eerie feeling of being exposed. He continued, "In the thousands of years since then, you have strayed. From the very beginning, you challenged your Father in heaven and tested him. Even though he had saved you from oppressive Egyptian rule with great miracles and fed you miraculous bread in the desert, you still rebelled. He turned history and nature upside down for you. He even split a sea for you, yet you still doubted his love for you." It was bizarre, but as the rabbi spoke, life seemed to feel very biblical all of a sudden. Many found the sensation extremely uncomfortable, kind of a spiritual twilight zone. He continues, "Many times you fell into the hands of your enemies and suffered only to cry out. As unworthy as you were still, the All-Merciful saved you with great miracles." The Redeemer raised his right arm and yelled out, "Yet you always return to follow the ways of your heart, the ways of the golden calf." The words were being listened to and witnessed by hundreds of millions of people, including American President James, the Russian president, and just about every other world leader. They seemed so bizarre and yet so prophetic. Was this really happening in the 21st century? Was history really coming to an end? Really? And then it continues, "Your God is a jealous God," the Redeemer continued, his voice somewhat choked up, his love for God apparent. "But he is a merciful one as well, so he waited for your return for thousands of years. He has waited for your return. But instead, you only moved further and further away, abandoning him. Though he continued to bless you, everywhere you have gone, you have been blessed. You have succeeded, even earning the envy of your Gentile neighbors." Back in Jerusalem, as the Redeemer spoke, Eli and his family crowded around the only television set they could find. It was in a neighbor's house down the street. Like many Israelis, they had ventured forth from their shelters when they heard the fighting stop and the storm begin. Eli was wide-eyed and in personal shock as he looked on, as was Rachel, his wife. All he could keep saying was, "It's him. That is him. I knew it. He's the one." Because earlier in the book, Eli had many meetings with this rabbi who was like a kind of like not the most famous rabbi, but very respected in Jerusalem. Okay. He felt so proud and honored to have been in his presence, to be trusted by him, to have learned with him, the Redeemer of the Jewish people. "He chastised you," the Redeemer continued, "to help you return to the ways of your holy Torah, but instead you rejected him. Instead, you imitated the ways of your Gentile neighbors and worked by their light, as opposed to them learning from your light, the light of Torah, the light of the Holy One, blessed be he." As the Redeemer spoke, non-religious Jews around the world were scrambling to find anything remotely Jewish to hold on to, terrified that their judgment was at hand. Some sat face in hands, distraught and crying, while others who had Orthodox acquaintances sought them out, as did non-Jews looking for a quick conversion. Nobody could really believe what was happening. It was all just too good to be true. Many elderly Jews who had just about given up on redemption coming in their lifetimes cried profusely, all the while praising God in between sobs. Zelda Feldman had been only 10 years old when she had witnessed the loss of her entire family at the hands of the Nazis. She used her remaining strength to make a fist and wave it heavenward. "I knew it," she cried out. "I told them you were there. I told them that you would." Then she broke out in a loud sobbing, as did many of her family members around her. She had raised them since the war, worried about her heart. They tried to calm her down, but she whimpered. I told them that you were still there, but you did love us, and that one day you would redeem us. In some Orthodox areas, there was dancing in the streets, celebrations for having lived to witness the era of the redemption. Some ran into synagogues and, grabbing the curtain from the ark, kissed it repeatedly. Others danced with their Sifrei Torah as if it was the holiday of Simchat Torah. In Israel, the reaction was mixed. The vast majority of Jews traveled from all over the country to try reach and greet what they now assumed to be their Redeemer. The veil of fear was beginning to lift, and they ran, often helping the wounded along the way, to the place where history was reaching its glorious climax. A minority of Israelis who had built their lives on extreme denial of God and Torah, who had even tried to undermine those who remained loyal to the ways of their ancestors, were stunned, shocked, and beside themselves. If the veil of fear had lifted for their fellow countrymen, it fallen hard on them. Prime Minister Dagon rose from his chair in front of his most trusted cabinet members and walked over to his desk, taking a special key out of his pocket. He unlocked the drawer, and to the amazement of all, he pulled out a yarmulke and placed it squarely on his head. Like his general a short time earlier, he felt his world shifting beneath him, and had faced the challenge head on. Gentlemen, he said to those present, I suggest you all do the same. The game is over, and we have lost it. Then he paused to consider his words, and then added, perhaps in truth, we have really won. Now came the words that all those watching had been waiting to hear. From the Redeemer, right? But my children, the Redeemer said, the time has come. Godless history has reached its end. Evil has been allowed to live for long enough. Today is that awesome day that our own prophets, your ancestors, warned you about. It is the day that the Master of the universe has come to collect his debt and to redeem his precious people. Return, wayward children, return, for the moment has come and gone. The Redeemer paused for a moment, then, turning his back on the world but towards the massive tank brigade, he paused for another moment. Then he raised his arms heavenward and said, as if to command creation, in the name of God who spoke and the world came into being, in the name of, at that point he pronounced the holy four-letter name of God as it is spelled, something that had not been permissible since the time of the temple. The time has come to rid the world of all evil and to fill the world with the knowledge of God, of his holy presence, and to fulfill the words of our holy prophet. On that day, God will be one and his name will be one. And just as the word one was heard, the television screens of hundreds of millions, if not billions of viewers, seemed to shake. The cameramen worked hard to steady their cameras and equipment. Earthquake could be heard around the world. And then, in full view of the world, the ground began to split right before the old man, who amazingly seemed unaffected. The split lengthened and widened, cutting all the way through Jerusalem. Then, suddenly, to the horror of all who were present, the tank brigade began to slide backwards as if some kind of powerful magnetic force was pulling it. Within seconds, these entire tank columns disappeared into the depths of the earth, and they were no more. There was screaming and panic everywhere, and even the people who were watching from thousands of miles away felt drawn in and absorbed by the drama. Powerless to do anything, they were compelled to sit and watch what was happening. In the skies above, any remaining enemy planes were suddenly sucked down as if in the midst of a massive hurricane. The Jewish pilots could only watch on in disbelief. There was none of the regular chatter of confident jet fighter pilots, just silence, complete silence. As the Israeli warplanes began to return to base, the pilots were afraid to report what they had seen. They had no clue what had been happening down below them and how many people had in fact been witnessing it. Back in Russia, President Leonid Kuchevskov was having enough of all of it. Not only were his plans of ruling the world destroyed, but he decided that he could not live in such a world as seemed to be evolving. Even the idea of escaping to some place in the West seemed a distant reality to him now. Thus, in the quiet of his own office, the Russian president went to his own desk and, using his own special key, unlocked a drawer. Opening the drawer, he calmly reached in and removed an object from within it. Then, sitting back in his favorite leather chair for the last time, he took his own life. On the other side of the world, in the White House, President James also sat in his own office, but he was not alone. Together with his war cabinet, he had been watching the televised report. For the time being, no one said a word because no one knew which word to say. In all of their training, they had never been prepared for such a scenario. All of a sudden, the president remembered Danny Max and had an overwhelming desire to speak to him. That was one of his counselors. As the remainder of the tanks all along the border of a tiny defenseless Israel disappeared, either into the abyss or in hasty retreat, the Redeemer began to lower his arms, and as his arms came down with staff in hand, the very one Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, had carried with him, the one which had the holy, ineffable name of God written on it. It seemed that the final chapter of history was also coming to an end. And just as quickly as the earth had allowed herself to be torn asunder in the name of the one who had created her, just under 6,000 years ago, with an equal amount of rumbling, she struggled to repair herself. Within moments, the breach in the earth had closed, the lightning and thunder ceased, and the clouds began to disperse. The sun's rays broke through majestically. Thus, once again, the light of creation began to shine for mankind. It was not just the light of the sun, but a primordial light, one that seemed to signal the entire universe, to the entire universe, that this was the dawning of a whole new era. After Mashiach comes, okay, so this is interesting. Listen to this. These are actually what we were planning on. These are excerpts from the Torah. Yeah. And from our sages as to what will happen when Mashiach comes. Okay.
Yeah.
So after Mashiach comes, a major war will be instigated against Israel, as mentioned in the Holy Zohar, in the section Shemos.
This is after Mashiach comes?
Yeah.
Interesting. That means he's already here.
Right. It doesn't necessarily say after Mashiach says what's up to everyone. It just says after Mashiach comes.
Interesting. Okay.
After Mashiach comes, a major war will be instigated against Israel, as mentioned in the Holy Zohar. See this at length until page 10. Okay. In the Zohar. It is also in Parashat Vayera on page 119a and Parashat Toldot on 139 in the Zohar. All of this is Zohar. Okay. It is also in Parashat Vayera 119a and I read that. Sorry, I apologize. This is the war of Gog and Magog, spoken about in Yecheskel, that's Ezekiel, in chapter 38, 39, and Zechariah 14. We got to read that, bro. As well, it's also spoken about in Midrash Tehillim, Mizmor 118:9. Fine. 3 times in the future, Gog and Magog will come against Israel and go up against Jerusalem. 3 times. And assemble and anger the nations with him to go up to Jerusalem, as it is explained there. Also, see Vayikra Rabbah, that's another Midrash, in 27:11, and many other places. After this, the Holy One, blessed be He, will take his revenge against them, as spoken about in Yecheskel, in Ezekiel, and the Jewish people will dwell in their land in security and in much good. Da'at, which is godly understanding, will greatly increase, as will wisdom and purity. Regarding manners of physicality, the world will continue, as it is now, for 40 years. With regard to this time, it says, there is no difference between this world and the Yemot HaMashiach, except for the oppression of the nations. Which means that during this time, nature will continue as we experience it now. But the only difference would be that we won't be oppressed by the other nations, and we'll be able to keep the entire Torah. Which means, the temple and everything, all the 630 commandments. Obviously, then, all the laws and mitzvot of Torah will still be performed, just as they're performed now, by the righteous, the pious and the holy. As it says, this is from Yechezkel, and I will take you from the nations and gather you, and I will sprinkle pure waters upon you, and I will give you a new heart and a new spirit. I will put my spirit within you, and I will make it so that you will follow my decrees and keep my judgments and do them. You will dwell in the land. That's Yechezkel chapter 36, verses 23 through 28. So that was that whole thing that we just read. That was from Rabbi Shlomo Eliashiv in his book Drushei Olam HaTohu, section 2.
AKA the Leshem.
Eliashiv.
Yeah, they called him the Leshem.
The Leshem, that's right. So continues. It did not take long for the entire world to learn of Mashiach's arrival. It did not happen overnight, but still within a quick period of time, mankind realigned its priorities. The pursuit of money was no longer the goal in anyone's life, and the great purging of the instruments of evil had begun. The Yetzer Hara was dead. That's the evil inclination.
Yeah.
Satan, basically, was dead.
Yeah.
Man's inclination to do evil given to him upon creation and absorbed by him after the sin of the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil had outlived its usefulness. As foretold by the Talmud, free will had come to an end since the presence of God became so revealed and sensed by all. The mask over the face of God was being removed, and doing evil could only be, at that time, a remote memory. The era of rebuilding mankind in preparation for return to the garden had begun in earnest. Jealousy, hatred, deceit, and the like were all things of the distant past. It became hard to understand how there ever existed in the first place. And sickness was no longer the will of God and disappeared completely. The division of religions was no more, now that God had revealed his will through the Jewish Redeemer. There was no room for dispute. For the non-Jewish world, what was compatible with the 7 Noahide laws remained. What was not was dispensed with. For the Jewish world, there was only the Torah and the complete loving devotion for every concept and mitzvah. Not a day went by that didn't result in increased purity, that didn't make one feel closer to God. The knowledge of God had truly filled the hearts and minds of all mankind. Nature's hold on life began to weaken as overt miracles became commonplace. Physical limitations, too, decreased. As a result, prophecy began to return. At first, only a few righteous people began to speak and teach directly in the name of God, as they once had in the temple times. But soon more and more people, obviously, became sensitive to this gift, and prophecy became commonplace. In Jerusalem, the third and final temple stood tall and majestically. Light radiated out from every opening and in all directions. People were drawn to it from all over the world to witness the Jewish priests, Kohanim, serve the one, true God of all mankind. They were also drawn to the place of the Prince, Mashiach ben David. God's conduit in this physical world, he instructed peoples from far and wide in their spiritual development. Daily he spoke, and when he did, the people came from miles around to hear his words. Thus, as hard as it was to imagine, it was true, and after almost 6 millennia of history, the words of King David had finally come true. Mankind had become like dreamers. This is not the end of the story, but just the beginning of it, Perhaps, God willing, the basis for a sequel.